It's my role, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our next speaker. Before I do, I'd just like to thank Roland and the organizers for such a rich conference. It certainly reminds me that my role when I was a minister, either in foreign affairs or national defense, that the biggest thing you could do is just be an empty vessel and let good ideas be poured into you. And when I see some of the people that forced fed me, or perhaps even waterboarded me with their ideas, like Morris and Bob Fowler and Jill Sinclair and Paul Heinbecker here, I realize in many ways we are very lucky to live in a country where we can share ideas like this amongst ourselves and try and advance the public good the way you are here today. One thing that came through so clearly in our sessions has been the immense change in the way in which foreign affairs, if I can call it that, is seen, or diplomacy is seen and done and practiced, and how and by whom. We've talked about the multiplicity of actors. We've seen talked of here cities, NGOs, other. Morris put it elegantly as talking about the diffusion of power from states to non-state actors, and Farah pointed out that there are benign and malevolent influences as a result of this. But I can't think of a better person to close this session that we've had these 2 days than our next speaker, Peter Singer. Because if you look at Peter's biography, and I'm not going to repeat it here because it's in your materials, he is the CEO of Grand Challenges Canada, which is funded by our government. It seeks to promote solutions to problems in global health around the world. I would suggest a value choice by the government for those interest in value debaters in the room. Peter is remarkably prepared from his background in health research and bioethics. He's been recognized for his work. He's got the Order of Canada's FRCS. He's got an enormous amount of experience, and he's moved around a great deal. He's very modest. He said to me, I've moved because I've failed here, and so I moved on again. But I think he's tended to fail upwards, if I could say that, Peter. And I think he's gone from strength to strength. And I also think he's a little sneaky, because for those of you who looked at this morning's Globe and Mail, on page A5, there's an article in there by Kim Mackerel, who is one of our panelists here today, about the very thing that he's going to talk to us about this afternoon. So he's already softened us up with this morning's newspaper. I'm sorry it wasn't on the internet, Peter. I'm really sorry. You're way behind the time. I should have known better than to try that trick. Well, he's seeded his presentation. He's well ahead of us. He has one other extraordinarily intelligent aspect of his character that I want to share with each and every one of you, is his daughter goes to Trinity College at the University of Toronto, and that's a very sensible choice for a person to make. Peter, come a chance.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's very humbling for me to be here with such an esteemed group, and I really couldn't figure out why anyone would invite me to be here and give this talk until this morning, when you were all talking about young people, the next generation, and on their behalf, I'm very proud to represent them here and to be with you. You know, if you think back to what we heard this morning, especially the first panel, think about the answer to this question. What implicates managing our relationships with the global south? What implicates a niche that Canada can hold? What implicates, or what is implicated by, Canada's assets? What is implicated by a new approach to global governance? What do the folks in the G20 who were not in the G7 actually want to focus on? And what is represented by a diplomacy of ideas? The answer to all those questions is innovation. And that is the theme that I'd like to focus on in this talk. But what I'd like to do first is share with you a vision of innovation for Canada. And that is, and this is in terms of foreign affairs, the vision would be that you think about innovation with the same valency as you think about treaties. In development, we become a true leader in innovation in development and are looked at by other countries as such. But you know, the problem with innovation, and it's evident already in the room, is as soon as you say that term, as soon as you utter that term, everybody's eyes glaze over. What the heck are you talking about? So actually, Bill referred to Kim's article, and there's some really good examples of what we're talking about. In the top right here, you see something called lucky iron fish. And let me just tell you that story. There was a graduate student from the University of Guelph. His name was Chris. He was actually supervised by Alistair Summerlee, who's the president of the University of Guelph. And he went to Cambodia. And he was very troubled by the problem of iron deficiency anemia in Cambodia. You know, if women are iron deficient and they are pregnant and as they deliver they have a hemorrhage, which is one of the top causes of maternal death, if you go in with a lower hemoglobin, you're more likely to die. If the child is iron deficient, they're less likely to learn well and will have lifelong deficits in their cognitive development. So it's a serious problem. He learned, this graduate student Chris, that in Cambodia people used to cook with iron pots, but they switched to aluminum because it's lighter and it's cheaper. And so what he came up with was, why don't we take an ingot of iron and stick it in the cooking pot while families are preparing dinner, and let's see if that has any effect on iron deficiency anemia. He did some studies, and in fact he found that it did decrease the rates of iron deficiency anemia. But when he went around into the communities, he found that people were using the ingots, but mostly to hold up books, to, as doorstops, because why would you take a big, ugly ingot and stick it in your cooking pot? So he went back into Cambodian culture and learned that there was a legend about a lucky fish. And you probably can't see that, but he then cast the iron ingots in the form of a lucky iron fish, and the fish actually even has a smile on it. This is the Cambodian equivalent of hotcakes. So this year, a social enterprise that was established in Cambodia by now a new graduate student, Gavin, also working under the auspices of Alistair Summerlee, but by now they'd spun it out into a social enterprise, and Alistair is the chairman of the board. This year, he expects to sell 12,000 of these ingots. Grand Challenges Canada, which is funded by the Government of Canada, as Bill mentioned, didn't give him a grant to continue this work because he's transitioning to scale. We actually gave him a loan, which puts a certain type of discipline into the work. So when you hear innovation, think about that story of lucky iron fish. But most importantly, keep in mind the fact that innovation is the pathway. Impact is the destination. So let me tell you a story about an innovation that's a little bit further along. This is a tube of chlorhexidine. Chlorhexidine is commonly found in mouthwash. About 3 years ago, Grand Challenges Canada partnered with the Gates Foundation, USAID, Norway, and DFID UK to launch a program called Saving Lives at Birth, which focuses on innovations to save the lives of women and children right around the time of birth. Did you know that 1 million children die on the day of their birth? And of the 6.3 million children that die under the age of 5, 2.9 million of them die in the first 30 days of life, the neonatal period. It's an incredible fact, and just this morning, the Newborn Action Plan was passed by the World Health Assembly. Well, one of the commonest causes of death, or one of the very common causes of death of newborns, is infection, sepsis. And often that sepsis comes in through the umbilical cord. So what this is, think about it as a type of polysporin for the umbilical cord. You put it on the umbilical cord, it sanitizes the umbilical cord, and has been shown to significantly reduce the risk of newborn death. In fact, for every 200 tubes distributed, it's estimated that one newborn death will be averted. One newborn life will be saved. The cost of each tube, 20 cents. We, through the partnership I mentioned, Saving Lives at Birth, supported a group called JSI to distribute these in Nepal. The innovation by now was actually how do you get it to people? They trained 30,000 health workers, have distributed 70,000 tubes, and this year it's spread to 5 countries, and it's estimated that 500,000 tubes will be distributed. That is not eyes glaze over innovation. That is innovation with impact. You know, in the broadest sense, innovation is aspirational. It really just says that tomorrow will be a brighter day than today. When you think innovation, think solutions. And that's where Madame Frechette almost got it right. She was talking primarily about ideas, but you have to put those ideas into action. And when you put those ideas into action, that's called innovation. And you can achieve the types of results that we're talking about. And don't only think about science and technology. I've already hinted about the delivery innovations in the chlorhexidine example. For example, Canada, through Grand Challenges Canada, funded a small microinsurance company in Kenya called Chamganka Microhealth. They wanted to test an electronic voucher mechanism for microinsurance that would pay for women to be transported to hospital or a health facility when they were in labor, pay for antenatal care, and actually that pilot test was successful. And about 3 months ago, Chamganka, a small and medium enterprise in Kenya, announced a partnership with Safaricom using the M-Pesa platform to take that pilot to scale. And don't only think about science and technology and business. Canada, through Grand Challenges Canada, in northern Nigeria, an area that's gotten a lot of attention in the last few weeks, funded a local NGO called DPRC to take imams, so-called refractory imams, who were not spreading, let's say, the optimal messages around women and children's health, to Al-Azhar University in Egypt, expose them to imams who were more knowledgeable about women and children's health. And they were able to show that when the original imams went back to northern Nigeria, their messaging improved, and the rates of childhood immunization in that area of northern Nigeria went up from 10% to about 30% in the control area, but 40% in the area where the imams had had the intervention. So when you think about innovation, think about science and technology, think about business innovation, think about social innovation. And I also don't want you only to think about health or only about agriculture. You know, my favorite grand challenge, and the grand challenges method is just a way of stimulating innovation with impact, and I'll come back to some other attributes in a moment. My favorite grand challenge is actually the one launched by USAID called Making All Voices Count, because it shows that the model of stimulating innovation can be applied to governance. This is about using technological means to improve participation in voting and in elections throughout the developing world. They've also done little mini piloting challenges to the issue of the panel this morning on atrocity prevention and on human trafficking. So I want you to realize that innovation can happen in any sector. And the question I want to ask before I go on is, are you guys really going to let USAID out-innovate Canada? That just makes no sense to me. Also, I mentioned the issue of Grand Challenges. What Grand Challenges is really about is it's fundamentally a governance platform. It's a way for different groups in different countries, public and private, to set a common goal and stimulate innovations to deal with that goal. So for example, when the 5 organizations I mentioned launched a grand challenge on saving lives at birth, that was fundamentally an exercise in governance of public and private organizations from 3 different countries, 5 different organizations, 4 different countries, 5 different organizations, trying to reduce maternal and newborn deaths. So think back to some of the stuff we heard in the last panel. This is a true example of Anne-Marie Slaughter does networked governance in innovation for non-state actors. And if you look at some of Anne-Marie Slaughter's writing and tweets, she actually uses grand challenges as an example of global governance. Finally, innovation is about accountability for results. It's about measuring results, it's about social investments, it's about impact investing. So I'm going to cap off that section of what I have to say. I've probably gone a little too long about that, but I did want to give some concrete examples and flesh out what exactly we mean by innovation. If for no other reason than one of the last tweets during the last session introduced an innovation drinking game. Somebody tweeted, "Innovation, let's drink," by which I think what he meant was people always say it, but they never really say what they're talking about, so it's more a drinking game than a real thing. So hopefully now it's a real thing. So having laid out a vision for Canada where you'll think about innovation in foreign policy just as easily as you think about treaties, and you'll work towards making Canada a leader in innovation in development, even better than USAID, if you could believe it. And having talked about what exactly we mean about innovation, let me now turn to the question of why is innovation critical in development, and then in particular, what are the benefits of innovation for Canada? Well, it's critical for development most obviously because of the social outcomes, and that's saving and improving lives. And I've already given you an example of that. Another example would be a social enterprise we fund in Haiti called Soil Haiti, which is about sanitation and toilets. They rent the toilets, they collect the effluent, they turn the effluent into fertilizer, they use the fertilizer to grow vegetables, they sell the vegetables, and they're providing sanitation services to 2,650 people. So it's obvious that the social outcomes are important here. But innovation is also important because ask yourself this question: what are the sources of wealth in the world? There's really only 2 sources of wealth. Either you mine the minerals in the ground, or, to Madame Frechette's point, you mine the ideas in people's brains. Those are the 2 sources of wealth. And the last one is called innovation. And I want to ask you, why is innovation so much a focus, along with infrastructure, of the domestic policy for economic growth for any G7 country, but when it comes to international development, we don't think about innovation. We do in a small way, and I'm suggesting it should be larger. We think primarily about charity. And charity is important in acute humanitarian crises. There's absolutely no question about that. But that's only 15% of the aid envelope, innovation being about 5% of the aid envelope. There's a lot left there that offers room to take, let's say, a similar approach to what we might take domestically for economic growth internationally. And let me ask you this question. What is it that makes the Canadian public kind of sick of foreign aid, or to have fatigue around foreign aid? We already heard the answer when somebody was talking about Korea. What makes people and domestic publics, I think in many G7 countries, tired of foreign aid is there seems to be no end to it. There seems to be no exit strategy. Well, what innovation is about creating enterprises, about creating growth, about creating jobs. And it does represent an exit strategy. It does represent a way for countries to become self-reliant and to become wealthy. So those are some reasons why innovation is critical for development. But what are the benefits of innovation for Canada? Firstly, the lessons from innovation internationally can be very much applied to our innovation policy domestically. I'll give you a concrete example. Canada, through Grand Challenges Canada, invested $10 million. We were the anchor investor in something called the Global Health Investment Fund, an impact investing fund structured by JP Morgan, risk guaranteed by Gates in Sweden, that will It launched in the fall at $108 million, and it'll invest in a wide range of technologies for global health. Well, the lessons learned about using public finance to de-risk actually the perception of risk for private dollars and engage those dollars in a social, to a social effect are very applicable domestically. And so those lessons in innovation are important. There's also lessons that are important for our social policy. So for example, one of our programs is called Saving Brains, around early child development. If you want to make sure a country stays poor forever, all you need to do is ignore the first 1,000 days of life, because the threats to a child's growing brain in the first 1,000 days of life will forever predetermine the economic trajectory of that child. In Guatemala, it's been shown that good nutrition in that period boosts wages by 46% when people are 20, 25 years old, those children. In Jamaica, it's been shown that exposure to gun violence in that early period yields higher levels of criminality and gun violence arrests when kids are 18 to 20. So the kind of lessons in social policy, be it on child development, be it on global health, that one learns in the developing world, can also be applied domestically. And in the area of innovation, there's one additional benefit, which is the price points in the developing world need to be low. So most innovation that you see domestically is actually a teensy-weensy bit better, but a heck of a lot more expensive. When you're innovating in development, actually it's often as good, not necessarily better, but radically less expensive. So it offers the opportunity for really interesting new business models, affordable innovation to bring those innovations back into Canada. A couple of final points in terms of benefits for Canada. This really can help to reinforce diplomacy. So one of the things we were very privileged to do earlier this year, and we've been working on it for a couple of years, is work with the government of Israel to help incubate a Grand Challenges Israel, which launched in January during the Prime Minister's visit to Israel. Imagine taking all that entrepreneurial spirit of Israel, all that innovative spirit, and systematically applying it against challenges of emerging and developing countries. That had been done anecdotally, but as the chief economist of Israel explained to me, most of our innovation is targeted at just a couple of rich world markets and in a couple of technological sectors. So imagine the benefit to the world of being able to do that, not to mention the strengthening of ties between Israel and Canada. ASEAN has been mentioned. I had the dubious privilege of attending a subcommittee of a subcommittee of a subcommittee of a subcommittee of the ASEAN thingamajig. And we were talking about grand challenges for ASEAN and what a grand challenge as ASEAN would look like. Mr. Clark mentioned this morning, and I heard this when I was there, that Canada had been viewed as a very active player historically in the ASEAN. It had been seen to have gone away for a while, and it is now seen to be re-engaging. What better way would there be to re-engage than on the types of challenges that the 10 ASEAN countries themselves want to solve? And the ones they came up with were actually early child development, probably because I was in the room, livable cities, and a couple of other examples like that, dengue, which is increasingly becoming a threat here. And not only that, but the governance platform of Grand Challenges. What better way is there for 10 countries of differing means, from a Singapore down to a Burma, or Myanmar, to actually work together in concerted way against their common problems using innovation? So what I'm really arguing is that Grand Challenges can help project the Canada brand through diplomatic channels, the Israel example, and through trade channels, because most of those problems that I mentioned in Grand Challenges ASEAN will ultimately require the generation of small and medium enterprises to solve. And those small and medium enterprises can then trade with Canada. So in summary, I've argued a vision here that in foreign policy, we want to get to the point where innovation is as easily thought of as treaties. And in development, we want to get to the point where Canada is really seen as a leader in innovation and development. With the proud history of IDRC, and we're very close partners with IDRC, with the advent of Grand Challenges Canada, with the strength in our universities and our small and medium enterprise sector, Canada's actually well positioned to do this. We're already along the way. We're in pretty good shape towards that goal. But to be a real world leader could use a boost. I would love to see innovation integrated into every program that DFAT-D has. So for example, if you have a sectoral program like Women and Children's Health, have an innovation platform for it, or in agriculture, or in extractives. If you've got a regional program, like in ASEAN, have an innovation platform for it. It doesn't have to be 100% of the program. It could be 10% of the program. And it would put a huge boost in terms of our relationships with those countries and in those sectors. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you for sticking it out till the end, or almost the end. Very much appreciate your attention, and very much looking forward to your comments and questions. And I hope that I've lived up to Bill's point. In fact, I'm sure I've proven the point that the most redeeming thing about me is my daughter, who is a student at Trinity College. And Bill, at least there's that. So thank you very much.
Talk into it. So I will, maybe I could just conclude by saying, you know, it was my privilege as foreign minister often to deal with NGOs out in the field. And really, the reputation of our country is not just made by the governments, it's made by NGOs. And it's been a long history. I did a lot of work when I was younger in West Africa as a lawyer. And practically all the West African leaders I dealt with had been educated by priests and Catholic nuns that had come from Quebec. Quebec's influence in West Africa through the education programs of Africa was remarkable. It goes back over 100 years. So there's a huge depth of Canadian non-governmental activity throughout the world that has really contributed as much to Canada's reputation, if you like, as our participation in World War II, or many of the other aspects that we see of the official way in which Canada's reputation has been built. And I think, Peter, your stories of what you're doing with health around the world is going to be a modern equivalent of that. And it's great to, I'm sure there are people who want to ask you questions about how we can be more effective in doing it. So we've got about 10 minutes. We got any questions out there? Have we exhausted you all? There's a question. Yes, sir. Yes.
My name is Mahmoud Naki. I work at DFAT-D. Quick question. Often when we discuss innovation, I feel that some of the conversations tend to assume away politics and culture. And as you've pointed out, there's no shortage of good ideas. Very regularly, however, there are realities for why these ideas are not taken up in a local context. So I was hoping I could get your comments on how to bring these sorts of local and political and cultural and economic factors back into discussions on innovation. Thank you.
Thank you. Three quick points. Firstly, a compliment to DFAT-D. I mean, we have a former deputy minister of one part of DFAT-D, a former deputy minister of another part of DFAT-D here. DFAT-D is starting to get very serious about innovation. That's a very good thing. Second point, for the reasons I hope I was able to convince you of. Second point is an issue of risk. So one way to actually make sure ideas turn into implementation is to manage the risk. And this can be done on a platform outside of government, maybe more easily than a platform inside of government. And the way we manage the risk is we fund tons of proof of concept. We're like a venture capital firm. Lots of $100,000 to $250,000 ideas. And that's through scientific peer review with CIHR, et cetera. But we are extremely, and the question there is it a cool idea? And the funding is to answer the question of whether it works. We're very selective on the number of so-called transition to scale grants we'll fund, where we'll invest up to $1 million, ideally as a loan, but possibly as a grant, depending on the situation. The focus there is not on the coolness of the idea. It's on the leadership team, the capacity to execute, et cetera. So there's lessons learned about managing risk that's very important about success of turning ideas into reality. And then thirdly, you had a question about culture. We fund about 2/3 of our funds go to innovators in low and middle income countries, and about 1/3 to Canadians. And every Canadian has to partner with an innovator in a low and middle income country. So let me tell you a very quick story. I went to Tanzania, and we weren't getting the types of innovations that we wanted. We partnered with the head of the National Institute of Medical Research, Dr. Mwele Malachela. She locked a bunch of young people in a room and said, "You're not leaving here until you tell me your bold idea." And then they told her, and she said, "You're not leaving here until we complete your application together." They did. They sent it in. 6 of them were successful. 6 months later, I'm there in Tanzania, and a young woman gets up to describe her innovation of sprinkling some traditional powder in water to clean the water or something like that. And Mwele is kind of nudging me in the ribs, and she's saying, when we were in that room, everyone said that idea was so crazy. There's no way that she would ever have been funded. And the pride of that young woman in Tanzania who was there on the stage with her idea being pushed forward was incredible. And that is what Canada is doing. My parents came from Hungary in '56, and what Canada did for them was match talent to opportunity. And that's what fundamentally Canada is now doing in the story like the one I described.
Any other? Oh, sorry. Yes, sir. Yep.
Robert Greenhill. Just a thought, because Peter, I'm a huge fan of what you guys have done with Grand Challenges, but I see a challenge in terms of the innovation kind of narrative you just laid out. Because my experience coming from McKinsey, the narrow space, now with the World Economic Forum, is actually development is probably one of the most innovative sectors in the world. This idea that kind of development is this charity, old-fashioned, is just, at a general level, compelling, but nonsense, actually. And I think we need to be careful to make sure that we're laying out the narrative to reflect the realities today. I mean, the power of social entrepreneurship around the world, the power of innovation, of which Grand Challenges is a great example, is much more widespread. M-Pesa you referred to was actually developed by a social enterprise with DFID that the private sector, Vodafone and Safaricom, came into later. Micronutrients Initiative was a great precursor in terms of innovation. The way in which we did the advanced market commitment and a pneumococcal vaccine was also innovative. The way SEED in the last 20 or 30 years supported BRAC and Grameen as world leaders in microfinance and social enterprise. I guess part of the points would be, as we think about how we encourage innovation, we need to make sure the model isn't just we impose it from without because you guys are too old-fashioned and dumb to get it, but we actually unleash all the innovation that's also within. So I guess the question would be, how do you do that? How do you have social, public policy entrepreneurs like you coming in with that outside perspective, but while kind of respecting and unleashing the history of innovation that actually is already there?
Yeah, so firstly, just to reinforce everything you said, I actually agree with everything you said. And just to make a couple of quick points, at the political level, we do have a very proud history here of financial innovation that hasn't been told. When we had the sad event of Minister Flaherty dying, everybody talked about his contributions to the financial crisis. Many people talked about his contributions to disability policy. Nobody really told the story of his contributions actually to financial innovation in the area of development. And you go back and you look, and you mentioned the pneumococcal advanced market commitment. That was a picture that was always hanging in his boardroom when he signed that advanced market commitment. You look at ag results more recently. You look at Grand Challenges Canada. You look at a number of, so there's a proud history on the political side of financial innovation that Canada has, and other examples of both parties. Secondly, on the bureaucratic side, I have to agree with you. The champions of Grand Challenges Canada originally, in addition to the people I mentioned who were in the room, were people at senior levels of the public service like a Graham Flack, who has a history of serial innovation. Interestingly, they were also people at very junior levels of the public service. And so I just want to endorse your idea that there's a lot of innovation there. In terms of the broader thrust of your question, Robert, I also agree with that. I think the real challenge we have is how do you do a mind meld between, let's say, the 5% of funds that go to things identified as innovation and the 95% of funds that go to things identified as programs, some of which contain innovation, some of which don't. There's a natural experiment going on. You know, in the US, you've got the US Global Development Lab at USAID, which is part of that development agency. In Canada, you have a slightly more disconnected model with a freestanding outside a government organization, but with close ties to the government in a consortium model. That's Grand Challenges Canada. You have different models around the world, but I think from a machinery of government standpoint, the core issue is how are you able to embrace risk and take on failure? First and foremost, I can go around saying, this failed, that failed, this failed, that failed, here's what I learned from it. I think that's harder to do inside a government department. That's my guess. So I think it's about managing, being open about failure and learning from it. And you can't succeed in innovation without failing. Secondly, I think it's about how you join, and this is the hardest part, how you join the activities of something like a Grand Challenges Canada with the broader activities of something like DFAT-D. And we're doing very well on starting to translate that learning. We take our portfolio reviews, we learn from our colleagues in DFAT-D, but I think you have put your finger on a critically important machinery of government question in terms of being able really to achieve the vision that I described. And this doesn't just apply to DFAT-D. Any department of government could create an innovation platform and use it to learn. If you were a company, there's no way you would put all your funds into just exploiting your existing technologies and knowledge. You would put some into R&D, into exploring new ways of doing things, and fundamentally, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, but then you have to get finance to give you the money, which is an Ottawa inside story. Last question for Mr. MacArthur, and we've only got about 3 minutes
John
left.
MacArthur, I'd just say very quickly, building on Robert's point, I think this point of the narrative really matters because even Korea comes up very often. Korea is one of the great success stories of external capital, and it was a great aid story post-war, but also it's one of the kind of political tragedies, but Korea had its Green Revolution under Japanese colonial occupation, which was all about the science and innovation of Korean farming. And that's why Korea in 1960 was more productive than any African country is still yet today. And so there's a lot of mythologies around the role of basic science, which is why we have to understand that development is more than politics, it's science too. And I think the big piece, there is a 2x2. There's the innovation, and then there's taking things to scale. So the antiretroviral medicines were the innovation. The Global Fund was the institutional scale. Vaccines, Gavi, same thing. I think the big question is, how do we take the innovations that are public sector focused, and it's a question for you and what you've learned, as opposed to the market-focused ones, and what have you learned about how to get the scientific innovations faster to scale?
Well, you raised a couple of great global public sector examples. I mean, one of the best institutional innovations in the last 20 years is Gavi, and maybe the Global Fund. I also think that we have to think about domestic resource mobilization in emerging economies. So, you know, some of our work where we're funding innovators in mental health, I doubt that actually there's enough of a market to take that service delivery model to scale in, for example, Congo. So think about domestic resources merged with on the public side. But I also want to stress the point that there is probably billions of dollars of social capital that has not yet been unleashed. So if you have a quick look, I wrote an annual letter a couple of weeks ago that focuses on the lessons that we have learned on actually trying to use public finance to de-risk private finance, whether it's a model like social enterprise, the Soil Haiti, whether it's a model like shared value. We did a partnership with Becton Dickinson, that's a large company model. Whether it's a social angel model, there was a spin-off that we funded in Vancouver where an angel investor came in and we matched that. Whether it's a fund like the Global Health Investment Fund, those are the types of models. And just to reiterate what was said in the previous session, this is a situation of learning by doing and adapting. You cannot precondition this. There's no theoretical framework here, but it does represent a successive iterative process of actually financial innovation about development innovation. And if you don't have a platform to do that, you can't learn. And we're blessed in Canada, actually, to have a platform to do that, or a couple of platforms. And we need to be honest about the learnings. We need to be honest about our failures. We do need to scale, because pilotitis ain't where it's at. It doesn't matter if you have 500 innovations if none of them have scaled. It's irrelevant. And it's not about scale, it's about scaling impact. And one of the lessons we learned is it's not even so much about scaling impact, it's more about the sustainability of that scaled impact. So I'll tweet that thing, but those are some of the lessons that we learned on the social finance, but your points about public finance globally and in the domestic context are very well taken. And in closing, just want to thank many, many people in the room from whom I've had the opportunity to learn. And we're all in this together, and we're not maybe as good as we should be about honestly talking to each other about what we're learning, about our failures, and about how we can reinforce each other, because we certainly have the potential to get from a very good place to an outstanding place with that vision of Canada being regarded really as the leading country in the world for development innovation. Thank you.